Ethan Carter had never imagined that a quiet suburban existence could erupt into a battlefield of rules and resentments. A decorated military veteran turned city official, Ethan spent his days meticulously balancing work and passion. By night, he devoted himself to restoring classic cars, a labor of love that echoed the precise, methodical spirit he'd honed during his service. His modest home, tucked into a leafy cul-de-sac with meticulously trimmed lawns and a garage that doubled as his personal workshop, was his sanctuary. Every nail, every paint stroke on his vintage '57 Chevy was a reminder of the freedom he'd fought for. It was on one radiant autumn morning that Ethan's idyllic world began to crumble. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, a well-dressed, sharply tailored woman emerged from a sleek black car, her presence radiating entitlement. This was Kerren, a self-declared guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, and the unofficial queen of the Homeowners Association HOA. Clad in a pastel blazer and armed with a clipboard, Kerren was the embodiment of overzealous order. Her mission was singular: to enforce the HOA's ever-growing list of arbitrary rules, regardless of the cost to the residents. Kerren's eyes narrowed as she took in every detail of Ethan's property. "Mr. Carter," she called out in a tone that mixed faux politeness with disdain, "your property is a disgrace to our community standards." Ethan frowned. He had always believed in community, yet he could not fathom how his simple love for vintage automobiles and personalized home decor could be an offense. To him, the freedom to express himself, even on his own property, was paramount. Their first encounter set the tone for the escalating conflict. Kerren brandished a final warning notice, despite the fact that Ethan had never consented to these arbitrary HOA regulations. "Your porch lights, the arrangement of your shrubs, and yes, even the paint on your garage, are in violation," she declared, her voice laced with smug authority. Ethan's heart sank. He knew that this was less about safety or aesthetics, and more about Kerren's obsession with control. With a calm yet firm voice, he replied, "I take pride in my home and my work. If there's an issue, I'm willing to discuss it, but not under duress." The encounter left Ethan feeling both insulted and determined. His home wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of his independence and his right to live as he pleased. In the days that followed, neighbors whispered about Kerren's tyrannical approach to the HOA rules. Some recalled past instances of fines and inexplicable penalties, while others hesitated to get involved, fearing retaliation. But for Ethan, the matter was personal. Every crevice of his property was a testament to years of hard work and sacrifice, a legacy that Kerren's intrusive measures threatened to erase. That very evening, as twilight softened the edges of his modest abode, Ethan sat in his workshop reflecting on the day's confrontation. Tools lay scattered across the bench, and the gentle hum of a lathe provided a rhythmic backdrop to his troubled thoughts. It wasn't merely about a misplaced violation notice. It was about the invasion of personal space and the imposition of a rigid regime that held no regard for individual freedom. Kerren's intrusion wasn't an isolated incident. It was emblematic of a broader pattern of HOA overreach. The rules she championed were nothing more than a veneer for control. In her eyes, every deviation from an impossibly narrow standard of perfection was a threat to the communal order, a threat that she was duty-bound to eliminate. Ethan knew that if he didn't stand up to this absurdity now, his entire way of life could soon be reduced to a checklist of uniform regulations. The first spark of rebellion was lit on that day, as Ethan vowed to resist any attempt to transform his home into a sterile exhibit of HOA-approved conformity. He recalled the many nights spent poring over city ordinances and local laws, a background that now promised to be his shield against Kerren's relentless campaigns. With every fiber of his being, Ethan embraced the conviction that the rules should serve the people, not the other way around. This introduction marked not only the beginning of a personal battle, but also the start of a broader movement. Quiet murmurs of dissent were already stirring among the residents, as many began to question why a simple homeowner should be forced to live under the boot of an overzealous board member. As Ethan cleaned up his workshop, the spark of defiance had grown into a flicker of hope, a promise that one person's determination might well spark a revolution in the heart of suburbia. In that delicate balance between order and freedom, Ethan Carter was ready to tip the scales. The stage was set, the players introduced. Little did he know that this initial confrontation was merely the opening act of a long and dramatic showdown that would soon engulf the entire neighborhood. The morning after the initial showdown, Ethan awoke to a disturbing sight, a crisp envelope affixed to his front door. Inside, a notice demanded a $750 fine for violating community light regulations. The document was official, bearing the stamp of the HOA and the unmistakable signature of Kerren. The fine wasn't simply a monetary penalty. It was a declaration of war. Kerren, with her unyielding sense of entitlement, had decided that Ethan's home was a canvas for her self-appointed vision of perfection. Outside, the atmosphere was charged. Kerren stood on the sidewalk, arms folded as if to emphasize her control over the neighborhood. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Carter," she declared with a cool, unwavering tone that brooked no argument. To the untrained eye, her words might have sounded reasonable, but Ethan knew that they were steeped in the hypocrisy of a system designed solely to maintain Kerren's personal brand of order. Refusing to be cowed, Ethan calmly tucked the notice into his jacket pocket. He was well aware of local laws and ordinances that guaranteed homeowners the right to personal expression and property management. With his background as a city official, he wasn't about to surrender without a fight. Determinedly, he began drafting a formal letter of complaint, citing the exact clauses in the zoning law that rendered Kerren's demands unlawful. It wasn't long before he dispatched the letter to the local zoning office, confident that the law would soon vindicate his right to live as he wished. Yet, as soon as Ethan's challenge was made, the HOA retaliated. Within days, he found his property under an even tighter scrutiny. Anonymous tips, fabricated by someone with intimate knowledge of the HOA's operations, had reached local inspectors. Before he could even catch his breath, uninvited officials began knocking on his door, searching for violations that didn't exist. Kerren's influence had permeated far beyond the confines of her official notice. It had seeped into every facet of community oversight. Ethan's frustration grew as each day brought another new hurdle. Fines mounted, and warnings were plastered around his property like grim reminders of his defiance. Kerren's smug satisfaction was unmistakable. Every interaction, every dismissive nod or pointed remark, confirmed her belief that her authority was absolute. In meetings, she presented herself as a guardian of community aesthetics, while simultaneously wielding legal threats, as if they were mere pleasantries. Meanwhile, Ethan turned his frustration into fuel. Late into the night, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and municipal codes, he began to prepare for a counteroffensive. Every clause, every regulation that supported his rights, was meticulously noted. He reached out to sympathetic neighbors, quietly gauging whether they, too, were chafing under the intrusive rule of Kerren and her cronies. These neighbors, once silent and compliant, began to murmur their discontent. A sense of collective defiance began to crystallize among them. As the days passed, the conflict escalated into a full-blown public spectacle. At the next HOA meeting, tensions reached a boiling point. Kerren's tone was icy and inflexible as she detailed the latest infractions. Ethan, armed with printed copies of local ordinances, rose to speak. "I'm not just fighting for my property rights," he declared, voice resonating in the charged room. "I'm fighting for the right of every homeowner in this community to live without arbitrary oppression." The room fell into a heavy silence as board members exchanged uneasy glances. For many, Kerren's iron rule had always been a burden they silently endured. Yet Kerren was unrelenting. In a dramatic flourish, she dismissed Ethan's objections as mere personal grievances, an insult that underscored her belief in the infallibility of the HOA's power. Even as Ethan's words struck a chord, Kerren rallied the inspectors to double down on their efforts. The city, overwhelmed by a wave of suspicious complaints, found itself embroiled in a bureaucratic nightmare where every phone call and form became a weapon in Kerren's arsenal. In that moment, Ethan realized that the fight was not just about a single fine or a misplaced notice. It was about challenging a system that had overstepped its bounds. The battle lines were drawn. Ethan, with his calm defiance and unwavering commitment to justice, prepared for the long war ahead. The HOA's first power move had backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing submission, it had ignited a spirit of resistance that promised to upend the entire oppressive system. The HOA's tactics grew increasingly audacious. Kerren's next moves were designed to intimidate, her actions blurring the line between legal enforcement and outright abuse of power. In hushed tones around the neighborhood, whispers of false violations and unexplained fines turned into an undercurrent of discontent. One afternoon, as Ethan surveyed his property, he noticed something even more disturbing, a notice claiming that his driveway had been deemed non-compliant with modern aesthetic standards. The notice was filled with vague legal jargon, a trap meant to catch a homeowner unprepared. Determined not to be bullied into submission, Ethan embarked on an investigation of his own. Late one night, with a small handheld camera in hand, he began recording the evidence of the HOA's overreach. Hidden in the corners of his property, he captured every intrusive act. Inspectors rifling through his meticulously maintained garage, anonymous agents slipping through his garden, and Kerren herself, flanked by board members, issuing stern warnings as if she were dispensing royal edicts. The footage was damning, proof of a system corrupted by self-interest and unchecked authority. It wasn't long before the neighborhood began to reveal cracks in the HOA's facade. Several longtime residents, previously too timid to speak up, approached Ethan with their own accounts of harassment. One neighbor confided that fines had mysteriously disappeared from her mailbox after she questioned their legitimacy, while another admitted that board members had suddenly softened their tone whenever her name was mentioned in Kerren's presence. The pattern was unmistakable. Kerren's reign was based not on the community's welfare, but on her personal vendetta against anyone who dared to deviate from her vision. A breakthrough came when a sympathetic board member, disillusioned by Kerren's overbearing tactics, discreetly handed Ethan a stack of documents. These papers detailed irregularities in the HOA's financial records, suggesting that funds were being siphoned off for personal use. In hushed urgency, the board member confided, "Kerren's been using our funds to pay for her own expenses. No one else has dared to say a word until now." The revelation stung like betrayal. It wasn't merely an overzealous bureaucrat enforcing absurd rules. It was an intricate web of corruption designed to concentrate power in the hands of one self-important individual. Fueled by the new evidence, Ethan planned a counterattack. Every unethical fine, every underhanded tactic was cataloged in a growing dossier of proof. He began reaching out to local journalists and legal experts, preparing to expose the corruption that had festered within the HOA for far too long. Even as inspectors continued their invasive visits and Kerren ramped up her smear campaigns, Ethan's resolve hardened. This was not just about property rights anymore. It was about integrity, transparency, and the fundamental right to live free from tyranny. Kerren, sensing the shift in the wind, responded with even more draconian measures. Threats of eviction and even hints at seizing property surfaced, cloaked in the language of legal technicalities. Rumors spread that Kerren had secretly arranged for a private security firm to patrol the neighborhood, ostensibly to maintain order. But every extra patrol car and every unauthorized inspection only deepened the suspicion among the residents. A sense of dread began to replace the once placid suburban calm. At the next board meeting, tensions reached a fever pitch. Ethan arrived armed with his documented evidence, a thick dossier that detailed everything from illegal fines to unauthorized inspections. As he presented his case, a hush fell over the room. For the first time, the veneer of Kerren's authority showed signs of cracking. A few board members exchanged nervous looks, their previously unquestioned loyalty to Kerren now wavering in the face of incontrovertible evidence. Kerren, cornered and desperate, tried to maintain her composure. "These are isolated incidents," she insisted, her voice trembling just enough to betray her anxiety. But the damage had been done. Ethan's relentless pursuit of the truth had ignited a spark among the residents, and even within the HOA's own ranks. The community was beginning to see that their once trusted enforcer was nothing more than a bully with unchecked power. In the midst of this turmoil, Ethan's plan was clear: expose the corruption, dismantle the oppressive system, and restore dignity to the neighborhood. With every new piece of evidence, the scales of justice began to tip in his favor. The HOA's tactics, however underhanded they might be, were now part of an unfolding drama that could no longer be hidden in the shadows. As summer edged toward autumn, the HOA's tactics reached unprecedented levels of audacity. One cool morning, Ethan awoke to find his driveway, his cherished entryway, being ruthlessly torn up by heavy machinery. In the early light, a team of workers busily excavated the concrete, their actions masked as improvements mandated by the HOA. Kerren's voice, crisp and unyielding, rang out from the sidelines: "We're expanding sidewalks to enhance community safety." But Ethan knew better. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. Before he could protest, a tow truck arrived, and within minutes, his beloved vintage car was towed away under the guise of an aesthetic correction. The blatant overreach left Ethan fuming. Determined not to be pushed around any longer, he gathered every shred of evidence he could find. The excavation was recorded, and every detail of the unauthorized work was documented. With mounting proof in hand, he prepared for his next move: a public confrontation that would leave no doubt about the HOA's corruption. That evening, at the scheduled HOA meeting, Ethan arrived with a thick folder of legal documents and photographic evidence. The meeting hall was packed with anxious residents, many of whom had been similarly victimized by the HOA's unpredictable whims. Kerren, seated at the head of the room like a judge presiding over a one-woman court, was uncharacteristically flustered by Ethan's presence. Her usual smug smile was replaced with thinly veiled irritation. "Good evening," Ethan began, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm here to present the facts. Our community is under siege by a set of rules that have no basis in law, rules imposed by a single individual who has turned power into a personal vendetta." He proceeded to unveil his evidence, projecting images of the damaged driveway, the tow truck, and even a recorded conversation where Kerren boasted about bending the rules to maintain order. Gasps filled the room as neighbors saw for themselves the extent of the injustice. The board members, previously loyal to Kerren, now found themselves on the defensive. One by one, they hesitated to support her increasingly draconian measures. Some whispered that Kerren's authority had been built on a foundation of lies and arbitrary decisions. In that charged atmosphere, the community's sentiment began to shift. What was once seen as a minor nuisance was now recognized as a deliberate assault on their rights and livelihoods. Kerren tried to regain control, her voice rising in a frantic defense. "I am only enforcing the rules that we all agreed to abide by," she exclaimed, though her eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Our goal is to maintain the beauty and safety of this neighborhood." But her words rang hollow as Ethan produced copies of the city ordinances and legal precedents that clearly invalidated the HOA's unilateral decisions. The evidence was overwhelming. Kerren had no right to alter public spaces without due process, nor define or harass residents based on personal whims. With the room now divided, Ethan's courage emboldened others. Several neighbors stood up, recounting their own experiences of harassment, unauthorized fines, and inexplicable inspections. Their stories, interwoven with Ethan's evidence, created a tapestry of injustice that no one could ignore. In that moment, the HOA's power began to crumble under the weight of collective resistance. Kerren's face flushed with anger and desperation. She tried to order the meeting back to order, but the damage was done. The residents, once meek and compliant, now demanded accountability and transparency. The once mighty HOA was no longer an impregnable force, but a crumbling facade of power built on corruption. That night, as Ethan left the meeting with a sense of triumph and a renewed commitment to fight for his community, the seeds of change had been sown. The HOA's overreach had set off a chain reaction, a public reckoning that would force Kerren and her cronies to answer for their actions. And as the neighborhood buzzed with renewed hope, Ethan knew that this battle was far from over. The fight for freedom had only just begun. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Kerren escalated her campaign of intimidation to unprecedented heights. Determined to crush Ethan's burgeoning rebellion, she resorted to tactics that skirted, and then blatantly crossed, the line of legality. One gray morning, as the neighborhood slowly stirred awake, Kerren arrived with a contingent of individuals claiming to be community safety officers. Their presence was imposing, and as they circled Ethan's property, the message was clear. Defiance would no longer be tolerated. Kerren's next move was to involve the police. With a calculated air of authority, she dialed 911, alleging that Ethan's so-called excessive porch lights were causing a public disturbance. When the officers arrived, expecting a serious threat to community peace, they were met with a baffling scene: a proud, well-lit home and a homeowner who was, by all accounts, calm and collected. The officers' patience soon wore thin as Kerren insisted that the law was being defied in her jurisdiction. In a dramatic standoff, Ethan calmly produced his city official badge, a silent but potent reminder that the rules were on his side, not Kerren's. The encounter quickly turned sour for Kerren. The officers, realizing that the call had been a blatant misuse of their time, began to question her credibility. In the ensuing confusion, Kerren attempted yet another desperate maneuver. She secretly hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan, hoping to uncover anything, that would discredit him. However, fate intervened when Ethan's security cameras captured the PI skulking around his garage late one night. The footage, clear and damning, was an unequivocal admission of trespassing and espionage. At the next HOA meeting, the community was shown the video evidence. The room fell silent as Kerren's final act of desperation was laid bare for all to see. Ethan calmly played the footage on a projector, each frame a reminder of the lengths Kerren would go to maintain her stranglehold over the neighborhood. The public humiliation was complete. Not only had Kerren overstepped her bounds, but she had also violated the very privacy of the residents she was supposed to protect. In the midst of the scandal, Kerren's allies began to distance themselves. Board members, who once followed her lead with unquestioning loyalty, now found themselves mired in legal jeopardy. Rumors circulated that several of them had been complicit in her schemes, and the seeds of distrust grew into a full-blown rebellion within the organization. The community's anger was no longer aimed solely at Ethan's defiance, but at the entire corrupt system that had allowed Kerren to operate with impunity. With her options rapidly dwindling, Kerren tried one last gambit. In a rash, emotional decision, she confronted Ethan in person at his home, not to negotiate, but to issue a final, venomous threat. "You think you can defy me and get away with it," she spat, her voice a mixture of fury and desperation. "I have the power of the HOA, and soon the law, behind me." But Ethan's calm demeanor in the face of her tirade only further eroded her credibility. He responded simply, "The law is on my side, Kerren, and justice will have its day." That moment marked the beginning of the end for Kerren's reign. Her desperate, illegal actions had not only backfired, but had also united the community against her. The evidence of her misconduct was overwhelming, and every new revelation only deepened the public's resolve to see her removed from power. With the police now questioning her motives and local authorities investigating the entire affair, Kerren's grip on the HOA was slipping fast. The final confrontation was both personal and symbolic. Ethan's unwavering determination had transformed his personal battle into a crusade for the rights of every homeowner. And as Kerren's desperate moves unraveled before an increasingly skeptical public, it was clear that her time at the helm was over. In the weeks that followed Kerren's televised debacle, the neighborhood underwent a seismic shift. The once fear-driven silence among the residents was replaced by a chorus of anger and determination. Under the mounting weight of evidence and community pressure, the HOA could no longer operate as it had. At a special meeting convened by a coalition of emboldened homeowners, the unthinkable happened. Kerren was formally voted out of her position. The decision, passed with overwhelming support, was not merely a dismissal. It was a public repudiation of everything she had stood for. Ethan, now seen as the reluctant hero of the community, watched with quiet satisfaction as the power structure he had once battled crumbled before his eyes. The meeting room was charged with a sense of vindication. Neighbors who had long suffered under Kerren's oppressive tactics finally had a voice, and together they reclaimed their rights. As the meeting adjourned, heated conversations and hopeful smiles filled the air. One resident remarked, "For the first time in years, I feel like I actually belong to a community that cares about its people." But the collapse of Kerren's authority was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. In the wake of her downfall, local authorities launched a thorough investigation into the HOA's practices. The community was soon abuzz with news of fines, lawsuits, and even criminal charges against those implicated in the corruption. Kerren's cozy network of cronies, once so untouchable, was being systematically dismantled. One by one, board members who had enabled her tyranny were forced to resign or face legal consequences. The HOA, once a symbol of neighborhood pride, had become a byword for abuse of power. Ethan, who had spearheaded much of the resistance, remained humble throughout the process. He never sought personal glory. Instead, he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that justice was served. With the help of dedicated local lawyers, he assisted neighbors in filing a class action lawsuit against the HOA. The legal proceedings were long and grueling, but the momentum of the community's uprising could not be halted. Every court appearance, every new piece of evidence presented, chipped away at the foundation of the corrupt system. In a final symbolic act of defiance, as the day of the ultimate verdict drew near, Ethan took a stand outside the now abandoned HOA office. Surrounded by a throng of supportive neighbors, he delivered a speech that resonated far beyond the confines of their once oppressive neighborhood. "This isn't just about one person," he declared. "It's about reclaiming our right to live without fear and to decide what our community looks like." The words echoed through the crowd, a mic drop moment that signaled the irreversible change in the community's spirit. Kerren's once pristine reputation lay in ruins. Public humiliation had forced her to sell her house at a fraction of its value, and the very authorities she had once manipulated now saw her as a cautionary tale. As the legal dust began to settle, and the HOA's assets were liquidated to compensate the wronged homeowners, a palpable sense of justice filled the air. Ethan, though weary from the battle, savored the victory, a victory not just for himself, but for every resident who had dared to challenge the status quo. The HOA, stripped of its power, was finally dissolved. What remained was a rejuvenated community, determined to build a future defined by fairness, transparency, and unity. A future in which no one would ever be subjected to the tyranny of entitled individuals. With the HOA's internal collapse complete, the fallout extended into the courtroom. Local authorities, spurred on by the community's relentless pursuit of justice, imposed steep fines on those responsible for the illegal practices. Investigations revealed that not only had Kerren misappropriated funds, but her cronies had also been complicit in orchestrating baseless fines and unauthorized inspections. The legal system, determined to restore trust in community governance, initiated a class action lawsuit on behalf of the affected homeowners. Ethan found himself at the forefront of this legal battle. Working closely with a team of passionate attorneys, he helped organize detailed accounts of every violation. Testimonies from neighbors, coupled with Ethan's own meticulously gathered evidence, painted an unmistakable picture of corruption. The case quickly garnered local media attention, and soon national outlets began reporting on the unprecedented collapse of an HOA that had once reigned with an iron fist. In court, the arguments were straightforward. The evidence was irrefutable. The HOA had overstepped its legal boundaries at every turn. The judge, taking note of the systematic abuse of power, handed down a series of punitive fines that left the organization financially crippled. Several board members faced personal legal repercussions, their names now etched into the annals of local infamy. Ethan's final power move came when he stood before the judge to deliver a succinct statement of fact, highlighting the inherent injustice and calling for a complete overhaul of the system that had allowed such abuse to persist. For the community, The legal victory was more than just monetary restitution. It was a reclamation of their dignity and their rights. The ruling signified that even those in positions of power were not immune to the consequences of their actions. As the court proceedings drew to a close, the HOA was officially dissolved, and plans were set in motion to establish a new, transparent body that would truly represent the residents' interests. With the legal hammer having struck down the corrupt HOA, the personal consequences for Kerren were swift and merciless. Once the embodiment of untouchable authority, she now found herself isolated and ostracized. Public opinion turned rapidly against her as details of her unethical behavior flooded the media. Neighbors recounted their own harrowing experiences with Kerren, and social media buzzed with hashtags celebrating the community's victory over tyranny. Kerren's personal life, already frayed by the pressures of her unyielding role, began to unravel. Rumors of financial mismanagement and personal extravagance spread like wildfire. In one cruel twist of fate, her prize car was repossessed, an ironic end for someone who had once dictated aesthetic rules for others. Her personal relationships suffered too. Whispers of marital strife and divorce soon became tabloid fodder. The woman who had once been so confident in her ability to control every aspect of community life was now a figure of ridicule. For Ethan, watching Kerren's downfall was bittersweet. While the satisfaction of poetic justice warmed him, he remained ever focused on the broader goal of restoring fairness to his community. Every time he caught a glimpse of Kerren's dilapidated social media profiles or heard another resident recount the saga, he was reminded of the cost of unchecked authority. "I never wished this for anyone," he'd say quietly to himself. But sometimes, justice demands a reckoning. In a final public appearance that underscored her fall from grace, Kerren was forced to step down from all her community roles. The very HOA that she had once controlled was now managed by a diverse, elected board that promised transparency and accountability. As Kerren packed up her belongings, a former board member offered a parting remark that would echo through the neighborhood. "I hope you find peace in a life without the constant need to enforce rules that only serve your own ego." Her once sharp tongue, which had cut down so many of her neighbors, was now silenced by the bitter irony of her situation. Kerren's humiliation was complete, a public figure reduced to a cautionary tale about the perils of entitlement and abuse of power. In the weeks and months that followed Kerren's dramatic exit, the neighborhood began to heal. The once tense streets were now filled with genuine laughter and friendly exchanges. Homeowners, freed from the oppressive rules of the old HOA, took pride in their individuality and community spirit. Ethan's porch, once a battleground of bureaucratic tyranny, became a symbol of resilience and liberation. On an ordinary afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the neighborhood in warm light, Ethan sat in his favorite chair on the porch. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and neighbors strolled by, sharing anecdotes of the recent upheaval with a newfound sense of humor. Someone, ever the instigator, jokingly handed Ethan an HOA violation notice for having the wrong number of lawn gnomes. Ethan merely smirked, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of hard-won justice. It was a moment of poetic irony. Where once a tyrant had imposed arbitrary rules with a heavy hand, now the community celebrated the freedom to express their true selves, without fear of punitive fines or clandestine inspections. In the distance, a group of residents gathered for an impromptu barbecue, toasting to the resilience of a neighborhood that had reclaimed its soul. For Ethan, the journey had been as challenging as it was transformative. He had not only defended his own rights, but had sparked a movement that redefined what community meant. The battle against an overreaching authority had united people from every walk of life, creating bonds that would last well beyond the memory of Kerren's regime. As the evening deepened, Ethan leaned back in his chair and allowed a small smile to play on his lips, a silent mic drop that punctuated the final chapter of a long struggle. The era of Kerren and her entitled decrees was over. In its place stood a community ready to embrace the future with open arms, a living testament to the power of ordinary citizens standing together against injustice. And so, under the fading glow of twilight, as laughter mingled with the soft strains of a distant radio, the neighborhood closed another chapter, a chapter defined not by fear and oppression, but by unity, resilience, and the unyielding spirit of those who dared to challenge the status quo. Fade to black.